Hello, my name's Arif Ahmed and I teach philosophy at the University of Cambridge. This is the first of 5 short lectures in which I'll be talking about knowledge, the analysis of knowledge, problems with various analyses, and generally thinking about the idea of what knowledge is and how we can understand it. In this first section I'll be saying something about the motivation behind wanting to analyse knowledge and the basic differences between knowledge of the kind that we'll be discussing and other kinds of knowledge. In the next section, I'll be going into a bit more detail on what you might call the classical definition of knowledge, that is the tripartite definition. And then in the third and fourth sections, I'll be talking about a well-known problem for the classical definition, which is called the Gettier problem, and various attempts that have occurred in the 20th century to solve that problem. Then in the final section, I'll be saying something about why one should want an analysis of knowledge in any case, and whether there are alternative approaches to giving an analysis that might prove fruitful in other ways for understanding the concept. Okay, so we'll start with the subject that we're discussing, which is knowledge and the distinction between different kinds of knowledge. You can think of knowledge in 3 ways. There's what you might call knowledge that, or propositional knowledge, knowledge by acquaintance, and knowledge how. By knowledge that, I mean knowledge which can be described in terms of a proposition or statement or sentence which you can be said to know. This is probably the most common use of the term in English. So one might say, for instance, I know that today is Thursday, or I know that the weather is sunny, or any of many other things concerning historical statements, mathematical statements, even philosophical statements. The second kind of knowledge, which I call knowledge by acquaintance, is the use of the word knowledge where we don't talk about knowing that something is true, but just about knowing someone, for instance, or something. You might know London if you've lived there for a long time, or you might know a person if that person's a good friend of yours. Now, that use of the word knowledge is obviously related in some ways to the first use that I mentioned, but it's not obviously the same thing. Knowing a person isn't the same thing as knowing a lot of truths about him. For instance, you might know a lot of truths about Napoleon Bonaparte or Wellington, but nobody who's watching this video knows either of those persons. The third kind of knowledge that I mentioned, which is knowledge how, is what we talk about when you say, for instance, that you know how to swim, or you know how to ride a bicycle, or you know how to play the piano to a certain standard. Now, knowledge how is probably not the same thing as an ability. One reason to think that they're different is that if you do something, then it's clear that you have the ability to do it, but somebody might do something without knowing how to do it. If you think, for instance, the first time you play golf, supposing you putt a hole in one, we might say that you obviously have the ability to putt a hole in one, because you did, but it's not plausible to say that you know how to do it. So there's a distinction between ability and knowing how. Nevertheless, having an ability probably is in some way related to knowing how, and we think of knowing how as the possession of a kind of skill. Now, there are various schools of thought concerning the relationship between knowing how to do something and knowing that something is the case. So there are what are called the intellectualists, who think that knowing how to do something is basically a way of knowing certain truths or propositions. And then there are those who think that knowing how to do something is not the same as knowing those propositions at all, but it's something else which perhaps you may not even be able to articulate. I won't here be going into the arguments for and against those particular views. The important thing to keep in mind is that there is, at least on the face of it, a distinction between that and the other 2 kinds of knowledge that I mentioned, knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge that something is true. For most of the rest of what I'll be saying will be concerned with knowledge that something is true, and I'll be discussing, as I said, various attempts to analyse that concept. Okay, so let's now think a bit about what it is to know that something is the case. For instance, to know that today is Thursday, or to know that the Battle of Waterloo took place in 1815. There's obviously a difference, it seems, between knowing that something is true and simply having a true belief about it. One can have a true belief about something without knowing it because, for instance, one might have made a lucky guess. Plato gives an example where he says that a skillful lawyer, for instance, might trick a jury into believing what's true, but we still wouldn't say that the jury knows the truth of the matter. It's just that they've been, somehow fooled into believing something that happens to be true. So true belief is obviously not the same thing as knowledge. Knowledge is more than that. On the other hand, it seems as though you can, if you do know something, then you must believe it, and that belief must be true. If I know, for instance, that the Battle of Waterloo took place in 1815, then it has to be true that I believe that to be the case, and it has to be true that it is in fact the case. So we can say that if you know something, if you know a proposition P, then you believe that proposition and it is true. All of the things I've been saying so far are sort of partial steps towards what you might call an analysis of knowledge, and that has been the aim of a great deal of epistemology since the time of Plato. What do I mean by an analysis? Well, in analysing a concept, what we seek to do is we seek to give what you might call necessary and sufficient conditions for when it applies. What this means is that you would be able to say, for instance, a necessary condition for knowledge, that is what has to be true when you know something, and you can give sufficient conditions for it. That is, you can give conditions which, if they apply, then you do know something. If we can give conditions that are both necessary and sufficient for knowledge, then we've been able to say exactly when it is that somebody knows something. Another example where you might be able to give necessary and sufficient conditions for something would be in the case of, say, being a square. So we could say that being square means having 4 equal sides that are at right angles. That's a necessary and sufficient condition for being a square. And as the example illustrates, there's a connection between knowing the necessary and sufficient conditions for something and being able to understand it. In fact, if you look at it a certain way, it seems plausible enough that we have to be able to give necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge because, after all, we all understand how to use the term. All of us were probably taught the word knowledge and how to use it when we were pretty young, and we're all pretty confident in our judgments about a very large range of cases, whether or not there are cases in which somebody knows or doesn't know this or that particular proposition. But how can we tell whether somebody knows or not? It seems very plausible to think that you have, when you learn the meaning of the word, in your mind some kind of template or model or set of rules governing how you should be able to apply the word knowledge. But then the attempt to give necessary and sufficient conditions is just the attempt to make explicit what was already implicit in our minds all along. So when you learnt the word, you grasped these rules, but we weren't able to put those rules themselves into words. And this aspect of this motivation for analysis is basically that it attempts to make that explicit. In many ways, that's what philosophy does as a whole. It's an attempt to look at the things that guide us, perhaps subconsciously or in some other implicit way, and try and make them explicit so that we can subject them to further analysis, criticism, and perhaps change the ways that we do things. It's very hard to change the way you do anything, for the better or for the worse, in any deliberate way if you can't say exactly what it is that you're doing and look at the reasons for doing it that way. So that's one reason for wanting to motivate the idea that we can have necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge. I'll say a bit now about what kinds of things might go into these necessary and sufficient conditions. I've already mentioned that truth and belief count as necessary conditions for knowledge, so it seems plausible to think that if you know something, then you believe it, it's true, and some third or fourth or other condition is also in place. And a lot of the trouble that's been devoted to epistemology has been based on the search for that additional condition. Now, before going on to saying what those are, I'll say a little bit more about the truth condition and the belief condition. Probably I don't need to say very much about the truth condition. It seems clear enough that if you know something, for instance, that today is Thursday, then it has to be true that today is Thursday, and that's all that's meant by the truth condition. It's worth saying a little bit more about the belief condition, because whilst it seems plausible enough that if you know something, then you believe it, there is a question as to exactly what it is to believe something and what beliefs are supposed to be in the first place. We can think of beliefs, I think, reasonably enough, as a kind of representational state in your mind. So when you believe something, you're representing things to be this or that way. But actually, if you think about it, a lot of the time, the distinction between believing something and not believing something is just too crude to describe the state of mind that somebody has. It seems more plausible in a lot of cases to say that what state of mind somebody is in, as far as they represent the world, is in terms of their degree of confidence. So that, for instance, we might say that I believe that today is Thursday, and also I believe that Napoleon died in 1824, but in fact that glosses over a distinction, which is that I have a great deal more confidence that today is Thursday than I do in the proposition that Napoleon died in 1824, and we can't capture that distinction simply in terms of the dichotomy between believing something and not believing it. So a much more useful, I think, and plausible way of representing people's own ways of representing the world is in terms of degrees of confidence or degrees of belief, on a scale which goes from perhaps 0% to 100%, where 0% implies zero confidence and 100% implies full confidence. Now, it's not at all clear where, if we adopt that approach, we're going to fit it into the analysis of knowledge. It's not clear whether knowing something means that you should have at least 50% confidence in it, or 75% confidence in it, or 99% confidence in it, or if actually it requires that you have 100% full confidence in it. There are examples which put this kind of connection under pressure. If you think, for instance, about a lottery where you buy a ticket. If I buy a ticket to tomorrow's lottery, then my confidence that it isn't going to win might be very high. It might be as close to 100% as you like. But still, we'd hesitate to say that I believe that I'm not going to win. And even if in fact I'm not going to win, we'd hesitate to say that I know that I'm not going to win. So the connection between knowledge and this kind of degree of confidence that I talked about is unclear at best. Philosophers have spent a great deal of effort trying to make it clearer, but I would say it's not an area on which there's current agreement. For the moment then, let's stick with the idea that knowledge requires belief, and I shall from now on, in accordance with the tradition in modern epistemology until reasonably recently, treat belief as a state that you either have or don't. So we can say that you know something if it's true, only if it's true and you believe it, and if some further condition is fulfilled, then you do really know it. What is that further condition? Well, a number of ideas have been proposed, but the one that was undoubtedly most influential historically was the idea that to know something is to have a true justified belief in it. This means that the additional condition was justification. True belief with justification on this theory, what's called the tripartite theory, is knowledge. So what is justification? Well, we can think of it in various ways, but one very natural account of it, which probably is relatively close to the classical account that we find in Plato, is that a justification for a belief is possession of an explanation as to why that belief is true. So that if you know something, then you believe it, it's true, and you possess some kind of explanation as to why it's true. That way of thinking about justification places a great deal of onus on what's going on in the mind of the person who knows something. In order to know something, I must be able to explain why it's true, and that means that I should have more sophistication than just being able to understand the proposition. Do I know, for instance, the proposition that Napoleon died in 1824? Well, in a sense, I could explain why my belief is true, but it all depends on how demanding the requirement for an explanation is. Certain kinds of people I probably couldn't justify it to. So the notion of justification itself can take various forms. Next time, what we'll see is that actually on just about any plausible construal of the notion of justification, there are examples where it seems clear that justified true belief is not enough for knowledge.